This lecture carries on where we left off with the classical era, starting with the early period and then turning to, at the end of this class, the high classical era. Now in the Greek periods, the classical era is going to begin in 480 BCE and is marked by a very violent conflict with the Persians. The era will begin with the defeat of the Persians in 480 BCE, with Leonidas leading the Spartans on land and their infantry, and then Themistocles, the Athenian naval commander, holding the Persians off by sea. With this victory, we have a unified understanding of the Greek city-states, whose identity now is seen as being distinct from that of Asia. So now we have the birth of the division between the East and the West. This is a high point for the Greeks when we have some of the most amazing developments and accomplishments actually taking place in drama, history, statescraft, and philosophy, with individuals like Sophocles, Euripides, and Aeschylus writing very important plays and dramas, Herodotus actually defining what history is and what it should do, explaining why the Greeks won the Persian War. That's why history was invented. Heracles is going to be the great statesman who's going to be the model for politicians in the future. And then finally, Socrates is going to establish the notion of the Socratic method and philosophy. Where we left off with the dying warrior, we began to see how the Greeks are looking at anatomical correctness as a goal in their art, of actually suggesting the severity and the pathos in human drama. And here we can see that man being the measure of all things will lead the Greeks to seek an ideal based on the human form, specifically the nude male human form we will look at today. Now, in their investigation, they developed this notion of what we now understand of as classical art, that is centered around humanism, that is a human-centered way of viewing the world, that relates to us as humans, how we relate to it, what we see in the world, what it does for us. Rationalism, right? Understanding the world from an intellectual perspective and a rational perspective, generally using mathematics. And finally, idealism, that we're going to seek the best in what we are representing. Turning to Olympia, we have some of the earliest examples after the dying warrior of this early classical trend leading up to 450 BCE. Now, Olympia is going to be the site of the Olympic Games as they were established in ancient Greece. The site of the first great monument of classical art is going to be found here on the same site of the Olympic Games, supposedly founded by Heracles in honor of his father Zeus. Just as famous today as they were in antiquity, the Olympic Games, begun in 776 BCE, originally would have found representatives from each city-state in Greece competing to honor Zeus, the greatest of the Olympians, every Olympiad or every 4 years, just as we still celebrate it today. And also, just like today, we have representatives from each nation. Now, Pausanias, the Greek historian, states that this would have been the race the first established Olympic Games were to entertain the newborn Zeus. However, later Pindar is going to relate it to Heracles, who stated that he finished the labors, all 12 of them, and then established this festival to honor his father Zeus. It was here that Pelops would win the chariot race through trickery, a very famous story that resonated for Olympians and a warning not to cheat. This was so famous that it was included by Pausanias as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. After the pyramids of Giza, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Third, we find the statue of Zeus at Olympia, here in his own temple. Today, the temple of Zeus that would have housed this massive cult statue is in shambles and does not reflect its prior glory. In order to understand what this archaic temple would have looked like, we turn to others, such as the temple of Hera II at Pediment, Italy, from 460 BCE, built around the same time. Here we have fluted Doric order columns, an entablature, and a pediment, and triglyphs separating different scenes that here would be decorated with the labors of Heracles. Here we have an example modeled closely after the Temple of Zeus, and so we get a good idea of what this peripteral temple, or one with freestanding columns on all four sides, would have originally looked like intact, even though this is smaller. Here, in the section above, the pediment, we would have had decorative elements in many of these temples. In the pediment for the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, we have the story of Pelops, the person who cheated in order to win the hand of a beautiful princess. The story relates to the chariot race of Pelops and King Oenomaus, where he states that if the king's daughter is married, the king would die, a prophecy once stated. So we find that the king would challenge suitors to fixed chariot races. He had 18 in all killed, because he is going to be using the divine horses of Ares, and was the son of Ares, the god of war. Here we find the pediment sculptures taper off to the sides with the chariot horses of each who would be performing here. Zeus in the center, in the tallest section of the pediment, oversees the games because this is the temple to him and the games honor him. On either side we have paired off King Oenomaus and his wife, as well as Pelops and Hippodamia, the princess that was promised to him if he won this chariot race. Now, if we look carefully at the female figures, we note that even though we're moving into the classical period now, we still are going to have them covered up and reveal less of their anatomy than their male counterparts off to the sides. Note that Pelops, for instance, is shown nude. Here we find that Pelops, who was Poseidon's lover, helped him by bribing the king's groom Myrtilos to rig the royal chariot that King Oenomaus was riding. The king then died as part of the race due to the rigged chariot. Pelops, as it was promised, married Hippodamia, and Myrtilus drowned, cursing all of his descendants. Therefore, this faced the start of the Olympic chariot races, and would be a very obvious warning not to cheat. The figure off to the side, interestingly enough, who is going to be seated because he is at the tapering section of the pediment, is actually a seer. Now this is unusual, for we're actually showing the old sagging body and muscles and skin of an old man. But what, of course, makes this unique is how he reacts. And he is the only one to react, for he has foreknowledge of what will happen, that the descendants of Myrtilus will be cursed, that the king will die. Of course, showing him old, balding, and wrinkled with sagging muscles is something that the Greeks would not usually show, stating explicitly that you should cover that up. Here, what is interesting, though, because we're moving into the classical era, is we actually show true emotion, not the archaic smile, which, of course, would not be appropriate for a funerary marker. Just as one would weep and sorrowfully mourn the loss of a loved one, so too would we find that knowing that these people would die would require a certain degree of pathos on the part of the seer. Therefore, it is like the dying warrior, where we saw the transition to this early classical period, with the gravitas and the appropriate reaction being shown by the sculptures. The metopes are going to all be decorated appropriately, given that Heracles founds the Olympics, so they are going to be thematically connected to Heracles and his 12 labors. As we find that around it, the labors very often are associated with different events in the Olympics. Most of these labors of Heracles are only fragmentary, such as the first labor, the slaying of the Nemean lion, where virtually only the head and arms of the figures remain, yet the lion's corpse below is easily identifiable. The second one is even harder to discern here with the Stymphalian birds. The rest of them, such as capturing the Cretan bull, shows this X-shaped or chiastic composition, whereby Hercules is going to be striking this bull that makes up the opposite diagonal of the composition. And then finally, cleaning the Augean stables in a single day, he's shoveling manure here with the assistance of Athena, accomplishing this manual task in 24 hours. Here we have Athena, Heracles, and Atlas with the apples of the Hesperides, one of these metopes decorating the temple of Zeus, in which we find three monumental figures, nearly life-size, standing in quiet, serene dignity. You find that Heracles is undergoing immense strain, but we do not see that on his face. He is controlled, he is stoic. If we look at his face compared to the dying warrior, we see the strain, but we also can see that the classical Greeks expected one to control one's emotions, to once again not succumb to pain and weakness. The 12 Labors of Heracles are one of the most famous series of feats in history, and they begin with Heracles slaying the Nemean lion, and end with him capturing and bringing back Cerberus, the three-headed dog who guards Hades. In this instance, we're actually looking at labor number 11, which is one of the most famous and often reproduced and represented labors in Greek antiquity. That is when he is asked to steal the golden apples of the Hesperides. The story goes, Gaia, Mother Earth, gives her granddaughter Hera, the queen of the gods, golden apples of the Hesperides for a wedding gift. Now these golden apples grow on a magical tree with golden bark. She planted it in the garden at the foot of Mount Atlas, where Atlas holds up the dome of the heavens. However, the nymphs kept eating the fruit, so Hera set a 100-headed serpent Ladon to guard, or in another tradition, the three daughters of Atlas to guard this tree where the golden apples grow. Either way, they must travel to find Atlas, who then needs to be convinced to retrieve the apples. We find that Atlas agrees if Heracles will hold up the sky. Atlas returns with the apples successfully, but refuses to take back the sky. So Heracles, in a tricky fashion, states, "Let me take my lion skin and adjust it on my neck so that I'm more comfortable, and then I'll take it back from you." So Atlas takes the sky for a moment, and then Heracles quickly grabs the apples, and Atlas is stuck again holding the sky. Here we find that one of his supporters, Athena, who is a Greek goddess who supports the Athenians and the Greeks in general, is assisting Heracles in holding up the sky, a feat that even for a demigod of his strength, the strongest man who ever lived, is nearly impossible. Now here we have another scene illustrating gods in action, and we can see how, moving into the early classical era, we are now going to be adopting a severe style, as it is called, for we are abandoning riotous action from the archaic era and moving to a quiet and noble dignity that defines what we mean by classical, which is composed and controlled. So the calm before the storm, right, that we talked about earlier with Exixius and his Ajax and Achilles playing checkers, is going to foretell this gravity and tension of the classical period. We know that someone might be straining, or violence is about to occur, or once again someone might die in the next scene, but not yet. We have that moment before, that psychic tension building up. This leads us to the first freestanding early classical statue in history, the Kritios boy. Only 3 feet 10 inches tall because his legs are missing. This would have been a life-size statue. And we find the arms and legs are, of course, not intact. But nevertheless, this statue is incredibly important for our understanding of the evolution of Greek sculpture. We note that it's called the Kritios boy because we believe the sculptor Kritios was responsible for it. The forms are now soft and rounded, and we do have an interest in the muscular system, but a more carefully observed one. What is, of course, lacking here that differentiates it from the archaic era that we looked at last time is the calm expression. We no longer see that archaic smile. There is now a new severity, a solemnness, a seriousness to the statues. In addition, they also are going to begin breaking from that very unnatural Egyptian-inspired pose, where rigidly and frontally figures have their fists to their sides, with their left foot forward and right foot back. This is going to find that the shoulders and the hips remain parallel to one another, which of course is impossible if your hips are shifting. Then your shoulders will also counterbalance that shift. This leads to one of the most important discoveries in history for the visual arts and for understanding human anatomy, and that is Contrapposto. So Contrapposto is Italian for counterbalance, what the Greeks called chiastic for X-shaped. And what it refers to is a pose where the weight is going to be on one leg, in this case the left leg, while the other leg is left relaxed and is not supporting the weight. This causes the hips to shift downward towards the relaxed leg, and then the shoulders to shift in the opposite direction. So if we are to look at a diagram, the Contrapposto pose will always have the weight on one leg while the other is relaxed or unengaged. So we find that this now more accurately takes into account how humans actually stand, how they actually are going to shift their weight back and forth. No one is going to stand rigidly upright and plant their feet that are level with one another for any given time. Eventually we begin becoming tired and or exhausted, so we are going to shift our weight for the comfort that it brings us. So here you're going to have the upright version versus the Contrapposto version, where most of us stand, given most of our time and ability. Even when we are seated, we're going to shift our weight from one leg or side of our body to another. This discovery is going to have incredible consequences in the visual arts moving forward, as we see a rapid development and implementation of what this means to shift the weight from one side to the other in a more and more dramatic approach to the activities and action that figures are shown in. The first example we will show you is going to be found off of the city of Riace. Here, divers in 1972 are going to discover a heavily corroded bronze statue on the bottom of the sea. Now, only a hand was poking up, and so they brought it up and then polished it out. It was still filled with clay. And so, like many discoveries of this era, it comes from a shipwreck to one of the colonies that this statue was being shipped to. And so that's why the original bronze statues, and remember that most Greek statues originally are made in bronze. That's generally the only way we can find them surviving, is in a shipwrecked or buried scenario. So having polished this, we notice that there is an extension off of his left arm that is raised, and then a band around his head, and it looks like his right hand was holding something. Originally, he would have had a helmet, a shield, and a spear, all part of hoplite armor for your standard Greek regiment and infantrymen. Those were lost, so now we are left with the very naturalistic and very anatomically correct statue of a mature warrior here, known as the Riace warrior for where it was found. So you note that the life-likeness of the statue is going to come from the variation of different materials used. So we find that, remember, originally bronze is a very warm, very brown, ruddy color that would much more closely approximate flesh. Add to that eyeballs of bone and colored glass, silver teeth and eyelashes, and then copper lips and nipples, and then we have a very realistic statue, very lifelike. In this very balanced, perfected anatomy, we find that actual anatomical details would have been cast from men at the time, such as hands and feet, to get the veins and the metacarpals and distal phalanges of the hand down correct. So we find the youthful musculature seen here is going to be appended by and to a mature head. We have a heavy beard and a haggard face, yet a perfect body. Thus we are communicating the idea, the idealized perfect warrior who has the maturity and the experience of a man that is at least 35 years of age on a youthful body that has a powerful ability. So we find that they even separate out the eyelashes and eyebrows and then attach them to make it look lifelike. Here you can see the eyes, the lips, the teeth, all differentiated very carefully. Now this is a type, a mature type, where we find that the figure is lifting himself up, preparing to step out into battle, and has a mature full beard. In Greek civilization, men were not allowed to marry until reaching maturity, generally in their mid-30s. That is when they marry, they're going to buy property, they begin to vote, they practice in the military and serve in the military, and then serve in matters of state. Now this is bronze hollow casting that goes back to ancient Sumeria that we discussed. Here is a painting of a bronze foundry showing how they would cast the various parts of the body, hands, feet, torso, head, separately and then solder them together after they cooled. So again, with the lost wax casting method, we make a mold, right, a model, generally out of clay or terracotta, and then cover it with wax. That is then buried in the ground, and molten metal, generally bronze, poured into those holes. The bronze dries, leaving a thin shell of metal that is very strong and very lightweight. So here you have an example of how these would have been made, buried upside down in the ground to dissipate, to disperse the heat coming off of this molten metal as best that possibly can, and melting that thin shell around the figure. This gives us a figure that is 10 times lighter than a solid stone statue and with much greater tensile strength. It's going to survive without cracking much more efficiently and effectively than stone does. So we can see the detail they put into it, casting the molds of actual people's hands to get those veins, the greater truth to nature here, as we have a figure that is about to step out into battle, but not yet. We have the perfect potential for action with a perfect form, the idea of the perfect warrior. Here we are able to show again a greater range of motion with the arms now lifted up and outstretched. He's stepping out, all of the weight on his right leg while his left leg is about to step out and spin off as he looks out, but eyeing the battlefield to his right. So he'll step out and begin walking onto the battlefield to his right to engage with his enemy. Off Cape Artemision, we have another discovery of a shipwreck and a surviving bronze hollow-cast statue, in this case even further exploring the range of motion that one could achieve with bronze hollow casting. Here, the Zeus or Poseidon is going to be a figure, a mature, bearded figure with ideal musculature, with arms outstretched and legs outstretched. Of course, the range of motion shown here made possible thanks to bronze hollow casting, to where now we only have one foot on the ground, the other one pivoting off the ball of the foot as he is about to release a projectile forward from his right hand. Compared to the Riace warrior, we can see the development happening stage by stage, almost overnight, as artists are learning from one another of the possibilities that bronze hollow casting allows them for a greater and greater range of motion. Now, unlike the Riace warrior who lifts his arms slightly, we have a very open pose and a statue where the arms are outstretched radically to either side. The legs spread apart, and even the feet are not all the way on the ground. The back right foot pivots off the ball of the foot as he is about to release his projectile forward. The faces, again, showing the interest in this mature type that you find is going to be appreciated in Greek society. The wisdom that comes with age is going to be coupled with the ideal body type and the ability to accomplish anything. Now, we do not know if it's a Zeus or Poseidon, nor do we even know if it's an Olympic athlete, because we do not have what the figure was holding. If the figure was holding a trident, then, of course, it would be Poseidon, god of the sea. If the figure would have been holding a thunderbolt, he would have been Zeus, god of the skies and of Mount Olympus. And if he was holding a javelin, he could have been an Olympic athlete. We find that each one of these options are confusing because we, of course, do not have the ancient Greeks differentiating between the gods and perfect athletes or Olympic athletes and Olympians. Because, of course, the perfect individual is godlike. And, of course, those who won the Olympics were as close as you get to divinity. And so you find that man being the measure of all things pertains to the gods as well. This is further illustrated in the range of what a figure can do and the affinity for athletics and the Olympics with Myron's discobolus. Here we have the first named artist who produced many very famous works and so therefore is recorded in history as a very important sculptor. The discobolus, or discus thrower, is performing a feat in one of the events in the Olympics. This is a Roman marble copy after a bronze original, which you will read over and over again in any Greek art textbook. The reason for that is the original bronze examples of holocast do not survive because throughout history the bronze alloy is valuable and will be melted down to make weapons over time. The Romans, of course, coming in and conquering ancient Greece, have an affinity for Greek art and so are going to commission hundreds upon hundreds of copies of them. Now, you can tell that a statue is a copy and not an original fairly easily due to the additions that Roman artists had to make in order for the statues to stand up. So, for instance, even though this discus thrower should be in the middle of a field, throwing and hurling this discus a great distance, there is a tree stump seemingly behind him supporting him, which, of course, would not have been present. This tree stump or support is there because the figure cannot stand up in heavy as opposed to the original lightweight bronze. So we need to understand the symmetry and balance of this figure from one particular angle, that being seen from the front here as we see the legs in profile, the chest from the front, and the head from the front. If you look at the figure from other angles, he looks as though he is stumbling and or is not going to be able to catch his balance. But if you view it from this angle, the one in the center, you will note that he appears perfectly balanced and contained. Now, the reason for this balance comes from the perfect weighted central axis and then, of course, the symmetry of the figure. The vigorously implied motion is certainly here, as we note that he has wound all the way up and is about to come back around to release this projectile onto the field, but not yet. He is perfectly balanced in that moment in time where we have dynamic equilibrium, that we know he will move in the next moment, but visually he does not have to. Here we have a series of images of a discus thrower that show you the motion that you would have to make as you wind back and then release the discus for maximum distance. The body of the discobolus and then the arms, you'll notice, are going to form counterbalancing parenthetical citations that are going to balance out along the vertical axis on either side. Thus, the visual weight is balanced from this angle. So what we have with the ability of these Greek sculptors in bronze holocasting is to have an increased emphasis here on implied movement that is also coupled with balance. So in each one of these, even the Zeus or Poseidon, we can cut him down the middle. We have a strong vertical axis. His limbs on either side are bilaterally symmetrical. He is balanced. He is about to release a projectile, but not yet. We have the perfect dynamic equilibrium at this moment. Turning to arguably the most famous high classical sculpture, and also one that mysteriously does not survive because this is a copy, that is going to be created by Polykleitos, and that is his Doryphorus, or spear bearer, because we have a figure that would have originally been holding a spear. Here, Polykleitos of Argos, a very famous artist and theorist, is going to select the most desirable elements, the parts and proportion of the human figure, and append to that a perfect idealism, the idea of the most perfect figure with all flaws removed. So here we have physical perfection itself, in what is otherwise known as the Polykleiton style. Originally, the statue would have been an over life-size bronze statue of a figure holding a spear as seen here. So we must keep that in mind because, of course, we have that additional support which does not belong behind the spear bearer, and we have that rectangular section of marble that protrudes from his right wrist. This, of course, is going to prevent the figure or arm from breaking off if too much pressure is placed on the arm. Now, just like Myron's discobolus, the figure is understandable from only one viewing angle, from the front. From the back, the tree stump looks even more awkward. And from the side, of course, he turns the opposite direction. So we must look at this figure from the front as he steps off, right, and has all of the weight on his right leg with an engaged or relaxed left leg, with, of course, the spear being held in his left hand with his right arm relaxed as he looks off to his right. Now, this is going to be a Roman copy that is a model for athletes to work out harder, to push themselves, because it is modeled on the greatest warrior from antiquity, a larger-than-life-size bronze original of Achilles. It also illustrates a very important set of ideas and principles called the canon, from the treatise that Polykleitos also wrote of the same title. Now, a canon is going to be an ideal set of ratios, and literally means a measure, rule, or law. So the canon here, the Polykleiton canon, which he believes is ideal, calls for a figure that is 7 head lengths long. That being, you count out the height of the figure's head to the rest of the body, and it adds up to 7. Now, neither the treatise nor the work survives, but it is mentioned in multiple other treatises and by other contemporaries and in copies. The figure, like the Riace warrior, is in a perfect Contrapposto pose, what the Greeks called chiastic, which makes even more sense in this example with the Doryphorus, as we will discuss, given the systematic balancing taking place. Now, like the Riace warrior, this other ideal warrior, representing Achilles, looks off to his right, lifts his left hand to hold a weapon, and lowers his right arm. Now, the canon described by Polykleitos also includes the notion of symmetria, or commensurability, which is going to be the relationship of the parts of the body to one another. So the parts must be considered in relationship to the whole. So the first thing we need to point out is that the figure is 1/7 head lengths long, meaning that the head is going to be the measurement that we can then extrapolate from with the rest of the body, all the way down. So we find that the chest, for instance, is 2 head lengths across. His arm is going to be 2 head lengths down to the wrist, and so on. That is, of course, not the only place in which the measurement can be applied. If you are going to focus in on the details of the torso, you also can see that it is going to be equally divisible, in that the pectoral muscles and or the deltoids and or the bicep and or the abdominal muscles, all of which are going to be the same distance, and so are going to be mathematically harmonious. The cross balance and harmony can also be seen if you notice how the limbs are moving and in what direction. So visually, our eye is drawn to the left because he looks to the left. Then his arm moves down, drawing our eye downward. Then his left leg pushes out, directing our attention to the right, which in the final phase, his left arm lifts up. Therefore, we move back up. And so we have a continuous counterclockwise motion that we visually must attend to. So we're meant to contemplate the perfection of this figure as we move around it, as we intellectually engage with it, and think about how the math lines up, how the arms and legs are going to be balanced, how visually we continue to move, yet the figure is stationary and perfectly balanced and its spot where it is. We have that dynamic equilibrium. He is the perfect warrior with the perfect physique, but he need not move yet. Now, the chiastic composition, or Contrapposto, extends beyond the legs because we notice that the engaged arm and leg are on the opposite side of the body, that being the leg that's doing something, holding up the weight of the figure, and the arm that is holding up the weight of the spear. The same can be said for the limbs that are not doing anything, the relaxed limbs, where we find that the free arm dangles to the side, and on the opposite side of the body, the relaxed leg is also not supporting weight. So we find that in this chiastic or X-shaped pose, the figure is balanced in this fashion. That's where we find the notion of the Italian term contrapposto, counterbalance. He is counterbalanced across from the figure here, forming this X shape, this dynamic equilibrium, just like in compositions, overlapping diagonals are going to form X's that balance one another out, but are dynamic simultaneously. So just as with Myron's discobolus, we have implied yet balanced motion. We have that moment before he will step out onto the battlefield, before he will engage an enemy. He has not been wounded, he is not tired or exhausted, he is perfect in and of himself. He is also, if you look carefully at his face, on the verge of moving or speaking, for his lips begin to part, as though he's about to say something, just as he is about to push off with his left foot and begin walking. So what we have here is a very rapid evolution in Greek art that is going to be interested in mathematical balance and harmony, and this notion that the perfect individual will show us the perfect balanced forms of the cosmos, because in the human body we have the map for the universe, which will be carried on by the Roman architect Vitruvius, which leads, of course, Leonardo da Vinci to create the Vitruvian Man. Thus, it is easy to see with these examples why Winckelmann, the first art historian, wrote in his Thoughts on the Imitation of Greek Art in Painting and Sculpture of 1755 that, quote, noble simplicity and quiet grandeur. The more tranquil the state of the body, the more capable it is of portraying the true character of the soul. Hence, we find these figures are perfectly balanced with the potential for action, but are poised in this perfect moment like a wound spring. They need not move and or change what is happening because they are physically perfect and we understand intellectually their capacity. So Winckelmann chose these types of sculptures, like the Doryphorus, as the ideal in the classical period, the peak, the pinnacle of classical art and civilization, for it distilled what the culture was all about. Furthermore, he actually believed that these idealized representations were accurate due to the lifestyle of the ancient Greeks. This utopian idea of ancient Greece led him to believe that they should in the 18th century model their lives and culture on them, just as the founders of the United States thought that the ancient Greeks and Republican Rome made up ideal democracies, and so we designed our democracy after them. For Winkelmann here, he believed that, like the Doryphorus, because the Greeks lived simply and ate healthy and exercised often wearing loose clothing, that they actually appeared like this. They looked like these ideal specimens. This was the opposite of Winkelmann's own time, in which we have the opposite being the case. For people overate, they did not exercise, and they wore corseted fashions that do not allow muscles and sinew to easily breathe, as he explained. So reflecting the ideal of the Greek citizen, these sculptures that are in control of their emotions in the severe style are disciplined. Just as we would state with Pythagoras that man is the measure of all things, we are seeking an ideal based on the human form. Hence, as we find Socrates would once state that we should above all know thyself. We should know ourselves because we are the measure of the universe, and the perfection of an individual equals a god. So we should seek the inner significance of forms, right? Only these essential forms, thus nothing in excess. Another common Greek staple and bit of wisdom that is repeated throughout mythological stories and Greek folktales. Next time, we will dedicate an entire class and lecture just to the Parthenon and the amazing developments and what was carried out there.